Good morning. It is Monday, February the 7th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the novena and the declaration for spiritual warfare and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have Victoria, Joe Rogan, no free lunch, and our bodies, ourselves. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for February the 7th. My arrows of light will destroy the kingdom of darkness. I have promised that I will send out my arrows and scatter the enemy. Do not fear the kingdom of darkness, for I will protect you. Through my unfailing love, you will not be shaken. When the enemy appears before you for battle, I will burn them up as in a blazing furnace. My fire will consume them. Though they plot evil against you and devise wicked schemes, they cannot succeed. My arrows will flash like lightning, and I will destroy them. My sharp arrows will pierce their hearts. I am a righteous judge. I will display my wrath against the kingdom of darkness every day. I will sharpen my sword and will bend and string my bow. I have prepared my deadly weapons and have made ready my flaming arrows. Psalms 18, verses 13 through 15, Psalm 21, verses 9 through 12, and Psalm 7, verses 11 through 13. Prayer declaration. I release the arrow of the Lord's deliverance in my life. Ordain and release your arrows against my persecutors. Send your arrows and scatter the enemy. Let your arrow go forth as lightning against the enemy. Break their bones and pierce them through with your arrows. And that was the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for February the 7th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you, thank you. And now, traveling companions. I recently shared the trip of a lifetime with my cousin, Evelyn. In the early 1900s, our Finnish grandmother, Esteri, immigrated to the United States at the age of 18. After the passing of our parents, Evelyn and I decided to connect with our family that still lived in Finland. Our purpose was to meet relatives and hear family stories, but the venture became much more. We reached out to the relatives there who we already knew and were welcome to visit. Unbeknownst to us, they began contacting more kin. They planned gatherings, meals, sightseeing, and more to make our stay memorable. We saw where our grandmother grew up and were even welcomed to stay in the ancestral home. As the 2 weeks sped by, Evelyn and I shared laughter and tears. We learned one another's strengths and easily navigated the challenges of traveling without understanding the language. We marveled at stories and grew to love our Finnish cousins. We understood our family history in a way we never had before. Finally, it was time to go home. We were sad to leave, but also thankful for all we had experienced. We had been transformed, healed. The grief of loss had been softened by the joy of gaining friendship in one another and in our newly discovered family. Diane Bennett, Nassau, Washington. For those who can escape to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, meteor showers are truly exquisite, especially in winter, as the high mountain air is crystal clear. Years ago, my college roommate and I set out in my sometimes working car for such a sight. This particular shower was forecast to be one of the best of the century. We packed a midwinter picnic of cider, oranges, and cheese melts, loaded up on warm layers of clothing, and headed out for a midnight viewing of this wonder. We nestled in a snowy alcove and set out our blankets. In our wildest dreams, we couldn't have imagined such a spectacular display. We watched, mesmerized, exchanging wishes for the future. As we dreamily made our way back down the mountain that night, those stars seemed to illuminate all that lay before us. I still think on this mountain adventure fondly, and every time I do, all my hopes are reignited. Paige Kelly, Salt Lake City, Utah. Imagine being told, pack your bags, I'm taking you to Maui. This sounds like a dream, but it actually happened to me last spring. Lynn, a lifelong friend and avid traveler, whisked me off to paradise. She organized the entire adventure, which felt like a once-in-a-lifetime trip. I had been struggling with several hardships over the past year, and Lynn knew I needed to focus on myself and the beauty around me. Her friendship healed me. We hiked the Garden of Eden Arboretum, got lost in the trails around Ohio Gulch Falls, rode horseback through the misty clouds atop island volcanoes, snorkeled Lahaina, and marveled over 1,000 dolphins flipping and twirling about us. The humpback whales waved at us. We rested our heads on the black sand beaches and devoured banana bread sundaes at the Halfway to Hana Cafe. This trip helped me to see the magic and beauty in the world again, all through my joyful friend's eyes. In the future, I hope to give this red carpet treatment to a friend in need. Everyone needs a friend like Lynn. Roxanne Becker, Eagan, Minnesota. When I was a teenager, I was in an exclusive female choir. Twice a year, we would travel about an hour out of town to a beautiful summer camp to participate in an intensive choir retreat. For 3 days and 2 nights, we learned an extensive repertoire. No sounds of children running on the docks or laughing as they paddled their canoes could be heard, but instead echoed the heavenly notes of voices studiously learning Bach or Britten. These retreats were something I looked forward to all year. I desired to belong to an all-girls school, and these times tucked away from the world in our own private little choir academy gave me just what my soul yearned for. All day long we would sing together or be sent off in our sections to break down difficult passages, later reuniting in the great room to hear all the parts combined. We would audition for solos and cheer one another on. During our breaks we would laugh and talk confidingly, go for walks, and in the evenings after our final rehearsal, all get into our pajamas and have a movie night. I particularly remember watching Little Women one year, and when the movie ended, a great debate erupted over whether or not Joe should have married Laurie. On the last day, our family and friends would make the trek to our remote location for an informal concert. The reaction was always the same. How in the world did you learn that much music so quickly? I was never sure how we did or how we managed to have so much fun and grow so close, but the sisterly bond forged through creating excellence and beauty resulted in some of the fondest memories of my life. Marin Latham, Parkland County, Alberta, Canada. After a difficult season, I decided on a whim to take my cousin Joyce and aunts Norma and Florrie to Grounds for Sculpture, a renowned outdoor hands-on museum of sorts. Though we did not have time to pursue the main park, we explored Rat's Restaurant, a French bistro named for a character in Wind in the Willows, and decorated in impressionist style. An exact replica of Monet's Japanese bridge and water lilies overlooked the veranda. We had so much fun taking photos and posing with lakeside sculptures. We laughed, reminisced, and planned a family reunion at this very place. Despite the sadness we felt from recent hardships, we were enchanted by this haven of art and childhood stories. Within this painterly sanctuary was a spirit that strengthened our camaraderie, assuring us that even though our gathering had been prompted by a sad occasion, it brought about genuine fun. On this venture, I found new material and sisterly figures, and our bond was baptized near the water lily font, where we discovered childlike faith in divine grace and a bright future. Leonora Obed, Ewing, New Jersey. Twice a year, 3 friends and I traveled to the coast to stay in a weekend house with big windows and a hot tub overlooking the Pacific. We leave on Friday morning, piling into an SUV alongside our totes and suitcases, and cheerfully chatting in anticipation of the adventure. On the way, we stop for coffee, buy fresh flowers, and check out a fashion boutique or two before finally arriving at the beach house in late afternoon. Eased by the foundation of our long relationships, having had more than 20 years of these retreats, means that we spread out easily into the house. Each of us had routines for settling in before we gathered around the large kitchen island with a glass of wine. Over the next days, we exchanged stories, admired the sunrises and sunsets, and renewed our treasured bonds. We admired the beauty around us, including the wild grasses swaying, waves washing in from other shores, and starry skies away from city lights. We pray over our families and share secrets in confidence. When Sunday morning comes, we clean house. We repack leftover food, makeup, and clothing. We lock up and wave goodbye to this place. Until next time. All is quiet on the way home. We've said all that needs saying. We've loved each other well, and we are ready to re-enter busy urban lives, knowing we're deeply cared for and that our true friends have our backs. How was it, asks our husbands and children, hugging us in welcome when we return. Wonderful, as always, we reply. Nothing beats a weekend with these treasured women. Rosemarie Dayer Kowalski, Kenmore, Washington. Standing on top of Arthur's Seat overlooking Edinburgh and his famous castle, my goddaughter and I reminisced on the 2-week jaunt we had taken into the Highlands of Scotland. We hiked for hours in the mountains, took ferries and trains, and ate some of the most wonderful mussels and langoustines available right out of the sea. But the best part was spending endless hours of the day in one another's companionship. Throughout the trip, we laughed at the Highland cows, drank whiskey right from the barrel, and of course found coffee and pastries everywhere we stopped. We rode the Jacobite steam train, famous for its appearance in the Harry Potter films, and enjoyed beautiful scenery and great food as we chugged through the mountains. We spent morning and evening hours sitting perched on a hillside overlooking my favorite Scottish town, Plockton, watching the sunset and tides come and go in the harbor. Those days seem like a treasure suspended in time, and they will always be in the forefront of our memories. Rebecca Parkinson, Charlotte, North Carolina. And that was a sample of some letters to Victoria magazine. Thank you. So Joe Rogan and how he handled this situation, how he should have handled it. This is one of the places where conservatives go wrong. This is one of the areas where conservatives end up getting too scared to open their mouths. Okay, so Joe Rogan is out, going out and he did it on some kind of a podcast or whatever, but he used the N-word, right? So didn't use it to be directed at a particular individual. It wasn't personal. It was used as perhaps as an example, whatever he did. Now, so what does the left do? The left comes along and says, aha, look what we have. We have this recording of Joe Rogan using the N-word. And that's all they do. They make no accusations. This is the way they always start. They want you to go ahead and draw the conclusions. We give you the facts, you decide. So they publish on social media this clip of him saying these words, and then let it sit and let everybody then jump in and opine and etc. Then what does Joe Rogan do? Well, he comes out and then he describes he says for number one, he explains. And then he describes. So he explains, I wasn't using it personally. I wasn't directing it as an insult at anybody. But he still describes the videos that were posted as horrible. Okay, so what he's done really there is confess. And the left is going to go ahead and continue to use these confessions. And by the way, as an aside, Spotify has decided they're not going to deplatform him. They're not going to take him down. That's inappropriate. But anyways, but the left is going to continue to use his confession as a weapon against him. And his confession is instantly believable because it's a statement against interest. People are going to think, well, if he didn't do it, why would he confess? If it wasn't horrible, why would he say it is? Right? So from now on, he's always going to be referred to as the talk show host that used the N-word, or racist talk show host, or bigoted talk show host. Why? Because in essence, he's confessed to it. Wrong answer. And this is for every conservative, because not only does this hurt him, but when he does this, it hurts everybody, every like-minded individual. It hurts all of his followers. And if he calls himself a conservative, then conservatives get tarred with the same brush. If you're a conservative, you listen to Joe Rogan, then you must be just as, fill in the pejorative of your choice, racist, bigot, as he is. Okay? So he's hurting everybody with this. What he should have done is say, when they put this video or audio up, he says, yeah, so what? What's your point? Okay, make them, the left, make an accusation. Make them come out and accuse you directly and come out and say, this is proof or this is evidence of whatever. You have to do that. You have to make them make the accusation. Okay, because otherwise you have two choices. First choice is try to prove a negative. Try to prove that you're not something that they suggest that you are, that they arbitrarily claim that you are, and that's impossible. Or confess. And so, again, he went ahead and confessed. Bad idea for the reasons I've already said. So, he should have made, if they're going to win, I always say, make them earn it. I see. You posted some interesting videos. What are these supposed to be? Don't even acknowledge that you're in it, right? So if somebody goes back and looks in my files and posts something on Instagram or whatever and says, "Here, listen to this. We got this from," then my first response is always going to be, "Okay, so what's this supposed to be? What's this supposed to be?" And that's what Rogan should have done. What is this supposed to be? Okay. Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If it's horrible, then why'd you say it in the first place? If it's horrible, then what's wrong with you and why the hell should we listen to you? If there's some kind of a weird beast lurking underneath the surface with Joe Rogan, why should we listen to him? And it'll be interesting to see, by the way, from now on, what it is that Joe Rogan is going to do, how he's going to handle his podcast, whether he's going to be much more careful about what he says and how he chooses his words, because that's part of the point here. Not only did they succeed and win in getting him to confess to something that may not be true, but for right now we're going to have to assume it's true because he confessed, but they very possibly, we'll have to see what he does from now on, have influenced him to keep his mouth shut, to alter what it is that he would normally say. So we'll see. But again, Joe Rogan should have made them prove it. That's in review here. He didn't. He handed them a victory. They won because he gave them the victory. They exercised power because Joe Rogan gave them the power. And conservatives do this all the time, and they need to knock it off. If they're going to win, make them earn it. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. Capitalism does not merely mean that the housewife may influence production by her choice between peas and beans, or that plant managers have some voice in deciding what and how to produce. It means a scheme of values, an attitude toward life, a civilization, the civilization of inequality and of the family fortune. Joseph A. Schumpeter. Free enterprise is a holistic concept, the sum total of human action, the process of allocating scarce resources, the attitudes and values that shape such actions, and the civilization which can come out of freedom and virtue. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, our bodies, ourselves. Huffa-puffa, down the sidewalk they come, pounding the cement with their $75 waffle-soled shoes. Huffa-puffa. First hundreds, then thousands, soon millions of Americans were tying on lurid plastic shoes, stripping down to nylon shorts and sleeveless athletic shirts, and jogging, or running, as its devotees always preferred to call it. It was a mass migration of people to rival the Crusades, minus only a destination. The Gallup Polling Company estimated in 1978 that 15 million American men and women jogged regularly. Between 1976 and 1978, membership in the New York City Roadrunners Club, an association of the city's most dedicated joggers, tripled from 2,000 to 6,000. Paid circulation of Runner's World, the premier joggers magazine, rocketed from 76,000 in May 1977 to 250,000 in May 1978. America had been gripped by fitness crazes before. The jogging boom followed immediately upon the great tennis mania of the early 70s. The Bancroft Sporting Goods Company, the oldest maker of tennis rackets in the United States, reported its sales of rackets more than doubled between 1971 and 1973. But unlike previous fads, which gripped only segments of society, the Midwest bowled, the Northeast skied, men hunted, women practiced yoga, jogging appealed to almost everybody. That same 78 Gallup survey found that joggers were divided almost precisely equally between those who had attended college and those who had not, and nearly evenly between men and women. Previous crazes had offered either amusement, golf, or more attractive body, calisthenics. Nobody would ever describe jogging as fun, and its aesthetic benefits are minimal. Yet, strangely enough, those very negatives constituted the essence of jogging's attraction. That it strengthened the heart and lungs without building a man's bicep or shrinking a woman's thighs proved that jogging was something one did not to please the opposite sex, but for oneself. Likewise, jogging's very dreariness proved that it was not some childish game, but a serious, even spiritual act, like meditation. James Fix's 1978 Complete Book of Running suggested that if one ran long enough and hard enough, one would experience a trance-like state, a mental plateau, where they felt miraculously purified and at peace with themselves and the world. Even if one never quite attained Fix's sublime state, the fact that one was seeking it marked one as a person of elevated consciousness. Exercise was the first sacrament of the new religion of the self. As Fix himself perceived, having lost faith in much of our society, government, business, marriage, the church, and so on, we seem to have turned to ourselves, putting what faith we can muster in our own minds and bodies. The knee injuries runners were always suffering were the equivalent of the bump on the forehead of a devout Muslim, an external sign of fidelity to the duties of one's creed. The lowered pulse rate of the long-distance runner signified more than a promise of longer life. Actually, not a very reliable promise. Fix dropped dead at age 52. It was what a theologian might describe as the outward sign of inward grace. Runners, the author of Joy of Running told a magazine interviewer, seek each other out. They regard other runners as good and trustworthy, particularly the marathon runner, and look down on other people, thinking of them as bad, lazy, indolent, immoral. If runners were superior, bicyclists were downright smug. Before 1970, bicycles were children's toys. Some 6.9 million bicycles were sold in the United States in 1970, down slightly from the 1968 peak, and 19 out of 20 of them were bought for children. Some adults did ride, most famously Paul Dudley White, a Boston cardiologist who made himself a prominent local character by pedaling to and from his hospital in the car-crazy 50s and early 60s. But there was a strong whiff of carrot juice drinking and sandal wearing about them. Then, in 1971, college students discovered in ecology a substitute for the passions roused by the fading Vietnam War. What better way to prove your dedication to the earth than by abandoning the car? In the first 4 months of 1971, a bicycle clip on one's right pant leg became the sign of commitment to the environmental cause. Since the best bikes were all imported, Raleigh and Dawes from Britain, Peugeot from France, the bicyclist could strike a second symbolic blow against the clodishness and junkiness of American industry. By the end of the third year of the bicycle boom, 1973, the industry had doubled its sales to 15.2 million bikes a year, more than half of them to adults. When the New York Times magazine profiled Robert Nozick, Harvard's libertarian philosopher in 1978, the professor had himself photographed toting his ultralight bike on his shoulder as he walked down the steps from his lecture hall. A perfect semiotic cue that this advocate of free markets was no Chamber of Commerce stooge. The new religion had its own garb, the tracksuits that fashion-conscious Americans now permitted themselves to wear in public, the tight shirts and pants that displayed a taut and trained body. It had its own hourly rituals, the little neck and hamstring stretches that runners would perform, not too discreetly, in movie lines. Above all, had its own special dietary laws. Harvey had got to know Marlene, wrote the author of The Serial, the best comic novel of the 1970s, as she checked out his groceries, expressing horror at the garbage he put in his one and only body. "Do you know what white flour does to you?" she asked him, handing the loaf of bread he'd picked out to a stock boy to go back on the shelf. "It kills your enzymes." Between 1968 and 1972, the number of health food stores in the United States more than doubled, from 1,200 to 2,600. Beef consumption, 54 pounds per person per year in 52, peaked in 1972 at 116 pounds per person. and then commenced a decline that continues to this day. That same year, 1972, Pepperidge Farm introduced an additive-free bread, and Sears Roebuck added an all-natural food and cosmetics section to its catalog. We don't know if health food is a trend or a fad, but Sears Roebuck can't afford to overlook any business that grosses $2 billion a year, explained the department store's health and beauty merchandise manager. That was merely the beginning, just as early Christianity progressed from celebrating its sacraments with battered cups and tin salvers to the gorgeous ornamentation of chalice, surplice, and salver in the High Middle Ages, so the sacraments of the cult of beauty were elaborated and beautified. It was a young New Jerseyite named Alice Waters who determined to make the natural foods of the 60s into food human beings would cheerfully eat. In 1971, she opened in Berkeley, California, one of the most influential institutions of the 70s, Chez Panisse. It insisted on local and organic ingredients, minimized the number of red meat offerings, and became one of the first American restaurants to serve 3-star meals in a room where nobody was expected to wear a necktie. At Chez Panisse, the horrible dandelion salad eaten by the hippies evolved into the deliciously bitter mesclun salad now served by ambitious eateries from Boise, Idaho to Tampa, Florida. Chez Panisse pioneered the custom of listing virtually every ingredient in a dish so that the food-fearful customers could be sure of precisely what they were eating. Sautéed black sea bass with olive and fennel sauce on a bed of young spinach, etc. What was happening at Chez Panisse was often compared in the 1970s to the nouvelle cuisine of French chefs like the Toigracio brothers, Jean and Pierre. The cuisines may sometimes have tasted similar, but their conceptions could not have been further apart. Nouvelle cuisine attempted to renovate and modernize French cooking to make tasty food healthier. The new cooking of California attempted to make palatable the hippie diet, to make health food tastier. Back in a minute. Thank you. Although the new French and American cooking of the 1970s originated on opposite sides of the dial, they tended naturally to converge. Yumminess, which the all-natural cooks at first only cared about was a way to introduce people to eat what was good for them, gradually became an end in itself. The people who bought exquisite flourless chocolate cakes at the elegant new patisseries that sprang up in medium-sized cities in the 1980s were very often the same people who had bought mealy carob brownies at the all-natural bakeries that opened in the 1970s. And the people who sold the cakes were even more surprisingly often the same people who had sold the carob brownies. Why not? Your body deserved the best. One rejected tap water in favor of Perrier, not only because one was showing off one's ability to pay $2 for a drink that had traditionally arrived free, not because one wanted to impress a date that one knew how to pronounce the French brand name, but because one was the sort of person who cared about his or her body. Perrier's consumers remained contentedly ignorant for years that the drink's carbonation was actually artificially infused and that the purity standards for American tap water were usually stricter than those for bottled waters of Europe. Understanding that the cult of exercise and the cult of food began as moral imperatives, the sacraments of the cult of the body, makes it possible to resolve the otherwise puzzling mystery of how the fitness-mad 1970s could also be so obsessed with fine food and drink. Name a fine American wine, and odds are it went into production between 1968 and 1980. Diamond Creek in 68, Clos Duval, Stag's Leap, Jordan, and Caymus in 1972. Trefethen in 1973, Joseph Phelps in 1974, Edna Valley in 1980. Nor were Americans neglecting the wines of Europe. Between 1968 and 82, imports of the French wine into the United States quadrupled. The 1970s were also the heroic age of American restauranting. Mark Miller stepped out of the Chez Panisse kitchen to move to the Southwest and opened the Coyote Cafe, the restaurant that first taught Americans that a great cuisine could be founded upon American regional specialties. Down the coastal highway from Alice Waters' Austrian immigrant Wolfgang Puck's Mama Maison and Spago belatedly liberated Hollywood cuisine from its long thraldom to the delicatessen traditions of vaudeville and Broadway. Pre-Spago, the movie industry's favorite restaurant was Chasen's, with specialties including such swift tickets to thrombosis as pork shoulder chili, braised short ribs, and hobo steak fried in 1 full pound of butter. Along the way, Puck transferred the gastronomic capital of America from New York City to Los Angeles, to which we can only say huzzah, right? Who wants to return to the days when dreary restaurants like the Colony and 21 were the best even New York City had to offer, or when American cooking meant vichyssoise, chop suey, and manicotti, to name 3 of the pseudo-foreign dishes invented on these shores? It must gratify patriots that Nancy Reagan would confidently replace French wines with Californian at White House dinners. It's painful today even to read a pre-1965 recipe, never mind eat one. The Alice B. Toklas cookbook, first published in 1954, contains a recipe for turkey with truffles. It begins, "For a turkey weighing 6 to 7 pounds, you will require 3 pounds of the fat that surrounds pork kidneys." So progress has been made, but grateful as we are for the herb-encrusted olive bread and the duck enchiladas, it's worth asking whether we are proud of ourselves for thinking as much about food and wine as we do. C.S. Lewis shrewdly observed that the sin of gluttony consists not of overeating, but of awarding food too central a place in one's life. The anorexic are just as much a glutton as the fat man. The picky eater is just as much as the greedy eater. Gluttony of the greedy type is, of course, as American as overstuffed apple pie. Gluttony of the persnickety type has been a harder time gaining a foothold in American culture. Historically, Americans were not fussy eaters. Raymond Chandler memorably complained that they would swallow anything if you put it between 2 slices of bread with lettuce and mayonnaise. To show overmuch concern with one's creature comforts, to be dainty at one's feeding, as the scornful old-fashioned phrase has it, used to seem absurd and unmanly. The dispelling of that prejudice is a cultural transformation of enormous proportions. Enormous, too, in a literal square footage sense. In a house built before 1970, the largest room will usually be the living room. The second biggest will probably be the dining room, which is normally sharply demarked from the kitchen. In the 1970s, the kitchen started to grow. People who could afford it built 2 chef kitchens with room for husband and wife to potter about together. Living room space began to spread around the cooking area so that guests could watch or participate in the cooking of the meal. The kitchen grew and grew until finally it had metamorphosed into the family room or great room of the 1990s, in which the children play, grown-ups watch television, and all but the very most formal dinner parties are held. The old living room and dining room, meanwhile, are atrophying into invisibility in exactly the same process that shrank the great hall of the Middle Ages into the humble front hall of today. Of course, it's not just food consciousness that explains the growth of the kitchen. Social and sexual changes played a part too. No longer was the wife prepared to work alone while her family and guests waited to be served. And not since the war had middle-class families been able to afford to hire cooks. On the other hand, the emancipation of women and the disappearance of servants from middle-class life might have equally plausibly caused the kitchen to shrink into a glorified airline galley containing only a microwave and a dishwasher. In 1969, futurists often predicted that this is exactly what would happen, and maybe there would not even be a dishwasher, because everyone would be eating off of disposable plates. Instead, at the very moment that cooking ceased to be women's work, food became a middle-class obsession. The monster kitchen is the consequence. If pre-1965 Americans hesitated to seem sensitive to comfort, they positively disdained safety. They lit rockets in their backyards on the 4th of July. They bought their steak marbled with fat. They smoked. They bought cars without seatbelts. They gave boys .22 caliber rifles for their 11th birthdays. How they would gape and stare at a contemporary playground with its rubber matting underneath the swings, safety belts on the teeter-totters, and 3-year-olds strapped into crash helmets before they can mount their tricycles. How they would snicker at grown men girding themselves like test pilots to pedal through the park. At a post office that airbrushes the cigarette out of Humphrey Bogart's hand lest some impressionable stamp collector get the wrong idea about smoking. At the massive Range Rovers we buy so that we can commute to the office without fear. Back then, one did not show so much concern for one's carcass. When Jacques Plante of the Montreal Canadiens became the first goaltender in the National Hockey League to adopt a face mask, it was only his extremely aggressive style. He moved farther out into the ice than any goalie had ever done, stealing the puck before the opposing team had a chance to fire off an aimed shot that protected him from the insinuations of cowardice. "My face is my mask," boasted the New York Rangers' Gump Worsley, who by the end of his career had collected some 800 stitches. Worsley lost the argument. By the end of the 70s, every goaltender and most forward players wore protective headgear. Back in a minute. Thank you. The 1970s were the decade when governments took up the job of extirpating physical danger. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency came into existence in 1970. The Consumer Product Safety Commission in 1972. The wind could roar through the Peter Fonda's hair in the Easy Rider in 1969, but he'd be paying many hundreds of dollars in fines if he tried the same stunt in 1979. Helmets have been compulsory on interstate highways since 1973. California took the next logical step and imposed the first compulsory bicycle helmet regulation in 1987. The Federal Department of Transportation issued orders in 1971 requiring lap and shoulder belts in all new cars by the summer of 1972. The following year, the Food and Drug Administration ordered that foods be labeled with percentage of daily requirements of a series of vitamins and minerals. In the same spirit of caution, the FDA was waiting longer to approve new drugs. In the mid-1970s, 13 of the 14 new drugs whose approval the FDA itself regarded as most important had become available in other countries before they could be sold in the United States. Smokers and non-smokers were segregated on airplanes in 1973. The Interstate Commerce Commission confined smokers to the symbolically loaded back 20% of the bus that same year. Airborne cigars and pipes were banned in 1977. The following year, Health Secretary Joseph Califano declared himself in favor of a total ban on airline smoking, although it took until 1990 for him to get his wish. In 1973, Arizona became the first state to ban smoking in public buildings, although it did permit ventilated areas to be designated for smokers. The federal government instituted its first set of restrictions on smoking in federal buildings in 1978. Discomfiting smokers did indeed discourage smoking. The Agriculture Department reported in 1980 that America's adults consume less tobacco per person in 1979 than at any time since 1898. Per person cigarette consumption in 1980 had tumbled to its lowest levels since 1957. The fewer the number of smokers, the more politically feasible it was to impose ferocious rules upon them. Smokers began to be seen less as adults exercising the right to opt for a less than perfectly healthy lifestyle, but as pitiful addicts at best, and as transmitters of filth and disease at worst. The public service announcements blared at them from television. Their children came home from school to lecture them about the perils of tobacco. Strangers felt free to approach and harangue them. It might be thought ironic that the decade in which Americans were most stridently told to quit being judgmental was the same decade in which the political authorities launched their most comprehensive and long-lasting campaign for the suppression of a vice since the repeal of Prohibition. The urge to chide and admonish our neighbors is one of the most deeply ingrained of human drives. As it was denied and thwarted in one realm of life after another, it accumulated in the one or two realms remaining to it with ever-intensifying force. The Americans of the 1970s had no more tolerance than their Victorian predecessors for pleasures they deemed dangerous. They might tolerate, even applaud, fornication, gambling, gluttony, and dandyism, but smokers were knowingly poisoning themselves. They were consciously violating the commandment to care for their bodies. They were something worse than dissidents. They were heretics whose every puff blasphemed against the new religion of the self. And that was Our Bodies, Ourselves, from How We Got Here, the 70s, the decade that, for better or worse, shaped modern life. Thank you. And this is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to tune into the John and Ken show if you get a chance. An excellent show, 2 to 6 p.m. on the West Coast, and on KFI AM 640. So until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.